Welcome to Law Matters, a show exploring current issues of social relevance. I'm your host, Jenifer Varzlay. Today we're continuing our discussion of the criminal practice of migrant smuggling and looking at the implications arising therefrom. We have seen that it is very difficult to stop this practice, even with the assistance of the international community and international and national legal regulations. We'll explore this further and look at possible solutions. The crossing from North Africa into Europe is one of the most popular routes we see used by migrant smugglers. This, so far, has become the deadliest year on record for migrant smuggling deaths. We have seen this according to recent United Nations Refugee Agency figures. This is as a result of barely seaworthy vessels often being crammed at overcapacity with potential migrants seeking a better life overseas. The problem with this practice is not that these people are seeking a better life, it's the process by which we see this occurring. While this has been criminalized, it is not a deterrent to those that are fleeing war-torn countries or have no economic prospects where they are currently living. As a result, it is for the international legal community, in line not only with international criminal regulation, but the investigatory powers of nations and indeed local communities to be able to solve this process. How do you stop this? I think it's almost impossible to do so. We have seen when we have discussed this in a previous episode, but today we are looking at if this is going to continue, how do we make it safer? How do we ensure that if there is an accident, those migrants can be rescued, or indeed if there is any peril, that this dangerous journey can be made slightly safer? In order to gauge public opinion on this dangerous practice, we asked people about their views on this topic.
I don't think they should immediately be forced to return. I think there should be, again, an opportunity for them to be sort of legally registered in the country, rather than sort of immediately thrown out. It sort of crushes their hope, and I think that's not something that we should ever have to do to anybody.
No, I don't think so. I mean, not if they, not if their own countries aren't safe. I mean, that's ridiculous because they're just going to keep trying to come back again. So I don't think they should be forced to return.
I do believe if they're here illegally, yes, because it's not always a case of we're getting the right kinds of people, because a lot of these people that can afford to come through, possibly criminals, it would be far better for them to be able to be put through some sort of checking process first. If skills are available, then yes, maybe, but not specifically.
No, they shouldn't be. They are escaping somewhere that's dangerous, so they should be protected by our government and by the governments across Europe.
In order to understand how these challenges might be best dealt with moving forward, we'll be speaking with Dr. Paolo Campana of the University of Cambridge. Thanks so much for being back on the show. It's great to see you again.
Thank you for having me back. Always a pleasure.
No problem. So looking again at this topic of migrant smuggling, what rights, if any, do these migrants have once they've reached the European Union?
Yes, that's a very good question. It really depends on the nationality, so the passport that a person carries. So at the moment, if you are from Syria or Eritrea, or to some extent Afghanistan, well, then you get asylum. 96% of the Syrians who actually arrived in Germany got asylum. There was 100% in Sweden. If you are from Syria, Eritrea, asylum. If you're not from these countries, well, then it becomes more complicated. Your asylum application might be refused. You might get some permit to stay for humanitarian reasons, but that's usually very short, a year. And there is a growing number of failed asylum seekers.
And then what happens? So, for example, if your asylum application is rejected, what's the next step?
That's a new territory, because technically what happens to you, if you are in, say, in Italy, you get a piece of paper that says you have your asylum application's been rejected, you have no rights to stay in this country, you have 7 days or 9 days, 10 days to leave. Goodbye. No money, nothing.
And do we see that happen in practice, or?
Well, it's very unlikely. It's very unlikely that migrants or failed asylum seekers that have the resources to go back. There is a relocation scheme run by IOM, but these numbers are tiny in comparison to the bigger numbers. What can happen at that point, some member states then would have the right to deport people back. Now, the question becomes, where? Countries cannot deport people back to Libya. There will be a breach of of human rights legislation. You need the agreement of the country of origin, and you need 2 police officers for every person that you are repatriating. So it's a very complicated and very expensive process. And I think this is going to be the topic, the big topic on the top of the agenda in the next 2 years in countries like Italy, Germany, Sweden, countries that have seen a very large number of requests for asylum.
And then I think you mentioned if these people stay, albeit illegally, what tends to happen? So how do they find work, if at all, and how does this impact those countries?
Yes, so that's a big issue for the years to come. As a general rule, I think for a country to function well, you want to give people right to work, access to legitimate jobs. Because that's in the best interest of everybody. The country, the host country, the people, the new arrivals, and that also has a positive impact on the crime rate, meaning the crime rate among the non-nationals tends to be more or less in line with the nationals. That's, I think, that should be the goal. Then it's a political decision. It's a political decision which approach to take. There are costs involved in all of them, and I think voters in the end will decide.
Certainly, that makes sense. And it has been reported in a number of United Nations documents that the punishment rates are low and there's a low risk of detection, but I understand that this is slowly changing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It is changing. It is changing, particularly in the European Union. So the penalties for human trafficking, for human smuggling have been increased. Now, prosecutors and police forces have started investigations. I also understand that countries like Norway have changed the legal code, the criminal code, so they can use certain techniques in human smuggling investigations that were not allowed before. So the situation is changing in the European Union. It's a completely different story in countries like Libya, where, well, no, you don't have basically a justice system, you don't have a government, you actually have 2 governments. So it really depends, but here in Europe it is changing.
That's very interesting. And then we've seen that this works, across different borders and through these different pathways of travel. How are these organizations structured to make that, flow properly or work?
Yeah, that was actually the topic of one of my papers where I reconstructed the smuggling ring from the Horn of Africa to Sweden. And I think there are 2 emerging patterns there. So you see that even in this ring that supply truly transnational commodity, the local dimension still plays a major role. So they are still highly localized. So you have the emergence of very rudimentary, localized hierarchies with smugglers at the top. And of course they coordinate across locales. Sometimes you have smugglers in Tripoli telling the migrants, once you get to Sicily, call this phone number and he will take care of the next leg. So there is coordination.
Oh, very interesting. And then just quickly, I know this is, as you said, $1 million question, but what needs to be done moving forward? So, you know, how can we start to solve some of these major issues?
This is a very complicated, in the end, it's a political decision. So there's a host of different steps. So for instance, Syria, you would have one answer, and it's probably ending the war in Syria. For other countries, we have different answers. So Eritrea, I think, is more complicated. Gambia would require a different approach. That's at the point of the country of origin. Then you can also have intervention at the border. So, for instance, the EU-Turkey deal. These are minefield because basically means making deals with countries and regime, maybe Libya or Sudan, which might think are not that pleasant.
No, absolutely. And thanks so much for shedding light on these issues and for joining us again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Smuggling networks along the central Mediterranean route are extremely well established. As we have seen, these are not one-man operations, these are complex organizations. As a result of this, the need for investigation and enforcement is extremely important. The need for coordination between governments and hence between nations is also of extreme importance in reducing the prevalence of this practice. The other key issue here is the safety of those involved. We have seen the need to protect their rights despite the fact that they have not been granted refugee status at the time of their movement, and in doing so, we need to ensure their safe passage. We have heard that this is a great moral dilemma because if you see nations help the safe passage of these people, you see the increase in this process occurring. While there isn't an easy answer moving forward, we do know that there needs to be increased legal regulation and enforcement as well as safe passage set up. Thank you for joining us and see you next time on Law Matters.